The winter of 1939 moved through Europe not with the slow grinding of traditional warfare, but with a speed that defied the logic of human endurance. German tank columns rolled through Poland in weeks, their crews operating around the clock without the expected collapse that exhaustion should have brought. Military observers from other nations watched with confused fascination as the Wehrmacht seemed to possess an almost supernatural capacity for sustained combat operations. What they didn't know, what the Reich preferred to keep wrapped in medical terminology and administrative secrecy, was that coursing through the veins of these soldiers was a crystalline substance that had transformed the very nature of human limitation: Pervitin. The name itself carried an innocent pharmaceutical quality, art a clean medical designation that concealed its true identity as methamphetamine, a synthetic stimulant that would become as integral to German military operations as the Panzer tank or the Stuka dive bomber. In the years leading up to the war, the German pharmaceutical company Temmler-Werke had refined the synthesis of this amphetamine derivative, marketing it to a civilian population as a mood enhancer and productivity aid. Housewives used it to manage their households with boundless energy. Students consumed it to push through examinations. Workers in factories took it to meet production quotas. The drug had woven itself into the fabric of German society so thoroughly that when military planners began considering its applications for warfare, they weren't introducing something foreign, but rather militarizing something already familiar. The chemical structure of methamphetamine tells the story of its power in the elegant language of organic chemistry. At its core sits a phenethylamine backbone, a simple aromatic ring attached to an amino group through a 2-carbon chain. The addition of a methyl group to this structure, a single carbon atom bonded to 3 hydrogens, creates a molecule capable of crossing the blood-brain barrier with remarkable efficiency. Once inside the brain, methamphetamine doesn't simply stimulate, it commands. The drug forces the release of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin while simultaneously blocking their reuptake, creating a neurochemical flood that overwhelms the brain's normal regulatory systems. The result is a state of heightened alertness, suppressed appetite, diminished need for sleep, and a profound sense of confidence that borders on invincibility. Military physicians recognized immediately what this meant for combat effectiveness. Sleep had always been the great equalizer in warfare, the biological requirement that forced even the most motivated armies to pause, to rest, to become vulnerable. But Pervitin offered the tantalizing possibility of soldiers who could operate continuously, who could push beyond the traditional limits of human endurance to maintain operational tempo while enemy forces slept. In 1938, the German military began systematic testing of the drug, distributing it to select units and carefully documenting the results. The data that emerged seemed almost too good to be true. Soldiers on Pervitin could march for longer periods, required less sleep, demonstrated improved reaction times, and reported feeling capable of extraordinary physical feats. By the time the invasion of Poland commenced in September 1939, Pervitin had been integrated into the Wehrmacht's supply chain with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized German military administration. The drug came packaged in small tablets, each containing 3 milligrams of pure methamphetamine, distributed in metal tubes that soldiers carried in their pockets alongside ammunition and field rations. The recommended dosage was 1 to 2 tablets to maintain alertness, though these recommendations would prove to be more aspirational than practical once the reality of combat set in. Field commanders, focused on maintaining operational momentum, had little incentive to enforce strict dosage protocols when the alternative was exhausted, combat ineffective troops. The Blitzkrieg through France in May 1940 showcased Pervitin's impact on military operations with stark clarity. German armored units moved with a relentless pace that bewildered Allied commanders who had planned their defenses around traditional operational rhythms. Tank crews would fight through the day, then continue through the night, their pupils dilated in the darkness, hands steady on the controls, despite 60, 70, even 90 hours without real sleep. The Ardennes offensive, that daring thrust through terrain the French had considered impassable for armor, succeeded in part because German forces maintained their momentum, when conventional military wisdom suggested they should have paused to rest and consolidate. Infantry units marched distances that should have been impossible, their legs moving with mechanical regularity long after their natural endurance should have failed. Lieutenant Heinrich Bull, who would later become one of Germany's most celebrated authors, left records of his Pervitin use during the French campaign in letters to his family. He wrote of feeling magnificent and absolutely awake, describing how the drug allowed him to write letters, stand watch, and maintain combat readiness without the crushing fatigue that had characterized earlier military service. His correspondence captures the seductive appeal of the drug, the way it seemed to offer a solution to the fundamental problem of human limitation in warfare. But Bull's later letters, written as the war ground on, would tell a different story, one of dependence and degradation that the early enthusiasm couldn't have predicted. So the mechanics of Pervitin distribution revealed the scale of German military commitment to the drug. Pharmaceutical production ramped up dramatically as the war expanded, with Temmler-Werk's facilities working at full capacity to meet military demand. Between April and July of 1940, during the height of the Western Offensive, the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe consumed more than 35 million tablets of Pervitin. This wasn't the occasional use of a performance enhancer. This was systematic, industrial-scale drugging of an entire military force. Medical officers received detailed instructions on distribution protocols, though these guidelines often dissolved under the pressures of combat operations. In practice, Pervitin became as routine as daily rations, another supply item to be requested, transported, and distributed through the military logistics network that kept German forces operating. The Luftwaffe embraced Pervitin with particular enthusiasm, recognizing its potential for long-range bombing missions and sustained air operations. Pilots flying multi-hour missions over Britain during the Battle of Britain relied on the drug to maintain focus and reaction speed, their hands steady on the controls as flak burst around them and RAF fighters dove from the sun. The drug earned the nickname Stuka tablets among bomber crews, a reference to the Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber that had become synonymous with German aerial assault. For pilots, the alternative to Pervitin wasn't just fatigue, it was death. A moment of inattention at altitude, a delayed reaction in combat, could mean falling from the sky in a burning aircraft. The drug offered what seemed like a simple equation: take the tablet, stay alive. But methamphetamine's effects extended beyond simple wakefulness into more complex and dangerous psychological territory. The drug doesn't just prevent sleep, it fundamentally alters perception and judgment. Users experience heightened confidence, a sense of invulnerability that can manifest as reckless courage in combat situations. Fear responses become dampened, not eliminated, creating soldiers who could advance under fire without the normal physiological reactions that would cause hesitation. This made Pervitin tactically valuable in the short term, producing troops who would execute aggressive maneuvers without the psychological friction that fear introduces. But this same confidence could tip into grandiosity and poor decision-making, as the drug's interference with normal risk assessment led to tactical errors that more rested, unmedicated soldiers might have avoided. The Eastern Front, that vast theater of unprecedented brutality, became the ultimate test of Pervitin's utility and cost. In the frozen wastes of Russia, where temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, and the concept of a stable front line dissolved into endless kilometers of contested territory, German soldiers consumed Pervitin, not just for tactical advantage, but for basic survival. The drug helped maintain body temperature by keeping metabolism elevated, helped soldiers ignore the gnawing pain of frostbite setting into fingers and toes, and provided the mental stamina to continue fighting in conditions that should have been physiologically impossible. Medical officers in Russia reported distributing Pervitin with unprecedented frequency, often abandoning any pretense of controlled dosing as units fought for survival in the Soviet winter. The siege of Stalingrad exposed the full horror of what sustained Pervitin use meant for human beings operating at the edge of endurance. German soldiers trapped in the pocket, surrounded by Soviet forces, consumed the drug not to maintain offensive operations, but simply to continue existing in conditions of absolute deprivation. They took Pervitin to ignore hunger as rations dwindled to nothing. They took it to ignore cold, as fuel for heating ran out. They took it to ignore the certainty of death that surrounded them in the ruins of that shattered city. In the final weeks of the siege, as the Sixth Army disintegrated, the medical officers reported soldiers with signs of acute methamphetamine toxicity, paranoia, hallucinations, cardiovascular collapse. But by then, the distinction between drug-induced symptoms and the symptoms of starvation, frostbite, and psychological trauma had become impossible to separate. The physiological cost of sustained methamphetamine use follows a predictable cascade of deterioration. The drug's mechanism of forcing neurotransmitter release creates an artificial state of activation that the body interprets as a crisis requiring immediate response. Heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, body temperature elevates, all systems mobilizing for what the brain perceives as a critical emergency. This state can be maintained for hours, even days, but the body keeps a ruthless accounting of these debts. When the drug finally wears off, or when the user's neurochemical reserves become so depleted that even methamphetamine can't force further release, the crash comes with devastating completeness. Soldiers would collapse into sleep so deep that artillery bombardment couldn't wake them. They would sleep for 12, 16, 20 hours, their bodies attempting to recover from days of forced operation beyond normal limits. The cognitive effects proved even more insidious than the physical toll. Chronic methamphetamine use damages the brain's dopamine system, the network of neurons responsible for motivation, pleasure, and motor control. German soldiers who had used Pervitin extensively for months or years began showing signs of this damage. Difficulty concentrating, impaired decision-making, emotional instability, and in severe cases, symptoms indistinguishable from schizophrenia. The Wehrmacht found itself with units whose combat effectiveness had been compromised not by enemy action, but by the very drug that was supposed to enhance their capabilities. Field reports from late in the war describe soldiers unable to follow basic orders, units paralyzed by paranoia and suspicion, men whose judgment had become so impaired that they posed a danger to themselves and their comrades. By 1940, even as Pervitin distribution continued, German military medical authorities had begun to recognize the scope of the problem they had created. Reports of dependence multiplied across all branches of service. Soldiers were taking tablets, not according to official protocols, but in response to their body's growing physiological demands for the drug. The recommended dose of 1 to 2 tablets had become meaningless as tolerance developed, with some soldiers consuming 10, 15, or more tablets daily. Medical officers attempted to implement stricter controls, requiring requisition forms and limiting distribution. But these administrative measures proved ineffective against the reality of addiction operating within a military force engaged in total war. The Allies, meanwhile, had been conducting their own experiments with amphetamines, though generally with more conservative dosing regimens and more attention to the risks of dependence. American forces used benzedrine, a related amphetamine compound, primarily for aircrew on long missions and for specific operations requiring sustained alertness. British forces similarly distributed amphetamines to bomber crews, but the scale remained different, reflecting different military cultures and different levels of desperation. The Wehrmacht's wholesale embrace of Pervitin represented something unprecedented: the systematic chemical modification of an entire military force's neurochemistry in service of operational objectives. The legacy of Pervitin extends beyond the immediate history of World War II into uncomfortable questions about performance enhancement, human limitation, and the ethics of military medicine. The drug revealed that it was possible to push human beings beyond their normal operational parameters, to extract performance that biology would normally prohibit. But it also demonstrated that these gains came with costs that weren't immediately apparent, that borrowing against future capability created debts that would eventually come due with interest. The Wehrmacht soldiers may have marched faster and fought longer than their opponents initially expected, but they did so by consuming their own neurological capital in ways that would permanently damage many of them. Modern militaries continue to grapple with these questions, though in more sophisticated forms. The development of modafinil, a wakefulness-promoting agent with less abuse potential than amphetamines, has given military planners new tools for managing sleep deprivation in combat operations. Special operations forces in multiple nations use pharmaceutical enhancement to maintain effectiveness during extended missions. But the specter of Pervitin remains, a warning about what happens when the pursuit of tactical advantage overrides medical ethics and basic human biology. The German experience demonstrated that you can indeed create soldiers who don't need sleep, who don't feel fear, who can operate beyond normal human limits. The question that history answered definitively is whether you should, and what happens to the human beings when you do. In the decades after the war, veterans across Germany struggled with the consequences of their Pervitin use. Many found themselves unable to function without stimulants, their brains' reward systems so damaged by years of forced dopamine release that normal life felt unbearably flat and meaningless. Some turned to other drugs, seeking to recreate the sense of capability and confidence that methamphetamine had provided. So others lived with permanent cognitive impairment, the neural damage from chronic stimulant use manifesting as memory problems, difficulty with executive function, and emotional dysregulation. The drug that had promised to make them superhuman had instead left them struggling with basic human function. The story of Pervitin is ultimately the story of a choice made by military and medical leadership to prioritize short-term tactical advantage over long-term human welfare. It's a story about the seductive appeal of pharmaceutical solutions to biological limitations, and the inevitable price that comes when those limitations are overridden rather than respected. The soldiers who consumed those tablets by the millions weren't making informed choices about risk and benefit. They were following orders, or trusting that their leadership understood the implications of what they were being given. That trust was betrayed by a system that valued their immediate combat effectiveness more than their long-term health and humanity. The legacy of that betrayal lives on in the bodies and minds of those who survived, a permanent reminder that some debts can never be fully repaid.